Welcome on this cold, rainy day. I've met all of you, I think, or nearly all of you. I'm Peter Rule from the Center for Higher and Adult Education, and I've been coordinating these Saturday sessions. Today, Professor van der Walt will also join us to do the session around discourse analysis. Okay. Unfortunately, we were going to do some stuff on quantitative analysis as well, but the person who was going to do it is ill, so we had to. Unfortunately, we can't do that. So I'm sorry about that. So the focus will mainly be on qualitative analysis, and we'll have sections on thematic content analysis, as well as discourse analysis and narrative analysis. So we'll focus on those three kinds of analysis. So I hope that you find that useful. I think just before we start with the program, if I could just ask you to introduce yourselves. If you could just tell us your name and whether you're doing a master's or PhD and what year you're in. And then if you could just give us one sentence about what you're thinking, what your interest is in data analysis. Okay, whether you're doing it now, whether you're planning to do it, whether you've already done it, just so I can get a sense of where you are regarding data analysis. Okay, right, will you start for us?
So big Prof, I'm busy with my master's in higher education. And it's the first year, so I'm still sort of looking at a topic for my thesis.
Okay, thanks very much, Jeanette.
Thank you. And I'm Shadrach. This is my first year. I registered in June. So I'm on a PhD. I'm working on a proposal.
Okay.
Naturally, I'm a quantitative person, but for my PhD, I'm doing quantitative. So it's working out well for me.
Okay, that's good. So that's a brave step to move from quantitative to qualitative, but I think you'll find that rewarding. Thank you, Shadrach. Yes. Tracy.
Hi, I'm Tracy. I'm a first-year master's student. I'm presently higher education qualification and first year, and I'm also like to feeling my mind.
Okay, good.
Analysis.
Good, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sean, second year master's in education policy studies. Trying to begin with my field work.
Okay, right.
So the session will be nice.
Okay, great. And are you planning to do qualitative or quantitative or both? Qualitative. Okay, thank you. Right. Sorry, at the back.
I'm Chiku. I'm doing a third year PhD in education policy. My major interest currently is to familiarize myself with some of the methods which I do not use. I do not necessarily use in my study. But yeah. Thanks very much.
Hi, I'm Prof. I'm actually an honor student that supervises this academic
Okay, great.
session because I'm starting my project collection soon.
Yes.
I'm doing my honors research paper on the challenges of teaching English literature.
Okay, great. Well, you're very welcome. Sorry, I just didn't catch your name. Shantae. Welcome, Shantae. Right.
Good morning. My name is I am PhD here. I'm doing a joint PhD degree between University of Amsterdam and the University of
Okay, great.
my second year of my PhD just started.
Okay.
It's doing a PhD in educational psychology.
Yes.
The data collection is done now, so I'm at the point that I will start, that I have to start the data analysis. So
Okay.
this was right on time.
Okay, good. Thank you. And you're welcome. Thank you. Right.
Goedemorgen.
Goedemorgen.
Good morning. I am a PhD student, historically, it's my fourth year. I'm very interested in discourse analysis.
Okay, great.
In a qualitative study, but discourse analysis challenge read a lot about leaders, discourse analysis.
Yes.
It's difficult sometimes.
Yes, it is difficult. Yes, thank you. Sorry, so I didn't get your name. The kettle's just...
Henry.
Henry. Hi, Henry. Thank you. Welcome. Right.
Good morning. My name is Miriam. I'm doing
Okay.
And I'm looking at strategies for teaching multiplication.
Okay. Right. Welcome, Miriam. Thank you. Right, and then at the back. Sorry.
Good morning. I'm Yofua Lomiko. I'm in the Department of Police Studies. I'm on a master's level.
Yes.
So my project is based on the teaching of the life skills education.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Good. Welcome. Can we have you? Right.
Hi, good morning. I'm Adele. I'm in my second year PhD in education. I've collected my data, written up some of my literature review, and I'm at this point where I need to start doing data analysis. So this is the timing's been perfect.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Right.
Good morning, everyone. Krishna Rock, second year PhD, Education Curriculum Studies, similar to Adele, as carbon copy, just complete the data collection
Okay.
and a bit of sort of categorization on thematic content analysis, but now it's a so what now? And
Yes.
what do I do with all the other data? So,
Okay. Good.
yeah.
Right. Thank you. Good. Well, welcome. Thank you. Hi.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jimmy. I'm doing my master's. I'm my third year now. And I've also just collected my data. It's on peer teaching in education. So I don't have a clue actually what to do with the data now.
Okay. Right.
So well, that's where I am.
Okay, thank you, Jeannie. I hope you'll get some ideas from our session. Right, welcome at the back. Would you mind just introducing yourself, what your name and what you're doing and what year you're in?
Morning, everyone. I'm Maya from Namibia. I'm doing my master's. I'm in my first year right now and doing my final touches on my proposal.
Okay.
And I'm actually I need to just finish with my proposal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm doing mathematics.
Okay. So are you in curriculum studies?
Come again?
Are you in curriculum studies?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Welcome. Right.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Marian. I'm also from Namibia. I'm doing my second year master's in education policy studies. A few months ago, I collected my data, and my topic is on gender mainstreaming policies. So I basically want to find out why principals mainstream gender policies in primary school the way they do. So yeah, so I actually want to get more insight on how to do the data presentation and analysis.
Okay, great. Good, thank you very much. That gives me a good sense of where we are. So we're going from honours to PhD and first year to, I think, third or fourth year. So we've got quite a wide span, but it sounds like you're all interested in data analysis. Either you planning how to do it, or you've collected your data and you're busy doing it. So please feel free to ask questions and to draw on your own experience and share that with us, because none of us know everything. You know, we all lifelong learners. You know, and especially me. So I find that I learn a huge amount from my own students. In fact, they become my teachers often. So don't feel that you've got a stupid question or something like that, because often other people have the same concern, and you will help other people by asking questions or commenting from your own experience. We'll have a mixture of presentation modes. So I will do a bit of kind of lecture input, and then we'll have a chance to do some exercises where we do a bit of data analysis ourselves with thematic analysis and discourse analysis and narrative analysis. So I hope you'll get a feeling of how to analyze data in different ways, and then you can think about how that might apply to your own plans or your own data. Right, so that's what we'll do. Good. So just to start off with, I'll give you a bit of input on qualitative analysis broadly and what is data analysis. And we will send you all of this stuff electronically, so don't worry about trying to capture all of it. Okay, so just to talk about qualitative data analysis. So I think all of you know we get different kinds of data, and we have our previous session was on methods of data collection, if you remember that. So we were talking about there's a whole lot of different methods. We talked about interviewing, if you remember, focus groups. We talked about observation, and hi, welcome. We talked about documents and looking at documents as well. And then, there's also statistical types of data collection. And there's multiple methods of data collection. But once you've got your data, what do you do with it? And that's really what we're going to focus on. And as I said, our main focus will be on qualitative data analysis. So first of all, what is data analysis? I suppose we need to think about what is data before we can ask that. So when we talked about data collection, we said that there's different kinds of data, and typically we think of data as you interview people and then they answer. So you've got data in the form of words, right? So that would be a very common form of data. On the other hand, you can get data in the form of numbers, right? So you might be analyzing matric results, for example. Then you've got lots of different tables, lots of different numbers, and you have to try and make sense of that. But what other kinds of data can we get besides words and numbers? Are you using any other kinds of data? Yes? Images, yeah. So that's really important. Pictures of various kinds. So it could be photographs, it could be drawings, it could be it could be students' artwork. You could be using photo voice as a method, which I think I mentioned that, where your participants take photographs and then talk about the photographs. So you could have a combination of different kinds of data coming from the same method, right? And then any other kinds of data besides images?
Video?
Yeah, video. So that a certain kind of moving pictures, right? So that could also be, so that could include audio as well as visual. So you can have that combination of audio-visual type of data as well, right? Yes, documents would be a kind of, it's made of words. Okay, so you'd say it's verbal, but it's written as opposed to spoken. So there's also that important difference, because even though they're both made of words, they have very different conventions, and we treat them in different ways. Okay.
And artifacts?
Artifacts, good, yeah. Can you give us an example of
like
that?
Sculptures,
Yes.
or I don't know, any archaeological findings that you get from space.
Yes, right. So the objects that you can feel and touch could be very important forms of data. So if you think about how we learn about people from ancient times, it's often through artifacts or through some kind of object that we can touch. You might, if you do work with learners in classrooms and they make things, that can also be a form of data. Okay, so data is quite a broad category, including not just words and numbers, but visual, audio, visual, as well as artifacts and so on. Okay. So data analysis is really trying to make sense of the data in a systematic way. Right. So just as when you collect data, you have to think how to do it systematically. So you don't just choose a random method. You have to have a good reason for which methods you choose and how you combine the methods. It's the same with data analysis. You have to think carefully about how am I going to analyze the data? Why am I using this method? How will it help me to answer my research questions? Okay, and how can I use perhaps more than one method of data analysis that will reinforce or complement or even challenge each other, right? So, that's why we talk about it as systematic. It can't just be at a whim. You have to have a strong rationale for how and why you analyze the data. The word analysis is really about, it means breaking up. So breaking up into, or fragmenting, so you can see what the different elements are. And then, I mean, we could also call it data synthesis, because once you've analyzed, you have to put it together again and make sense of how it connects. Right? So in a way, the word data analysis is a little bit misleading. It's not only about analysis, it's also about synthesis and interpretation. Okay, so that's really important to think about. I think, within a Western tradition, there tends to be an emphasis on pulling things apart and focusing on the smallest unit. But the process of data analysis also involves putting things together, connecting them, and seeing what the patterns are, which might be give you a meaning that's beyond the individual atomized data. Okay, the pattern might be greater than the sum of the parts. Okay, the sum of the parts might be greater. Right. So there's multiple methods of data analysis, and we're just going to touch on a few that are used quite commonly. And different kinds of data analysis can generate different kinds of interpretation. So that's why it's useful to think about more than one. Okay, you can just use one, but sometimes if you use more than one, you get different kinds of insights into the data, and then you can see how to combine or link them. Right. I'm just going to show you a quotation from Newman, and we'll analyze this quotation. So we'll do a bit of data analysis. But Newman is, I find he writes quite well about research methodology. And he says to analyze data means systematically, again that word, to organize, integrate, and examine. So it's more than one step. Organizing, integrating, meaning putting it together, and then examining. As we do this, we search for patterns and relationships. Right. So we're not only interested in the individual elements, but how they link to each other and what patterns they form. Among the specific details, to analyze, we connect particular data to concepts, advanced generalizations, and identify broad trends or themes. So that comes to the thing of so what. Right? You're saying, I've got my data. What do I? How do I make meaning of it? What we're trying to do is link that data, see the patterns, and then link it to concepts, to themes, and try to see if we can make some kind of generalizations from the data, depending on the kind of research we're doing. Analysis allows us to improve understanding, expand theory, and advance knowledge. So that's why we do it. Right. So let's see if we can pull that apart a bit and make a pattern out of that data. Right. So you see here I'm trying to work out what the relation is among those data. Okay. So all of it is about data and about the analysis of the data. But when Newman talks about data analysis, he's saying it's a complex process. So first of all, it involves organizing, integrating, examining. Right. So once you've got your data, you have to arrange it in some way that makes sense. Are you going to put together all the interviews and all the observations, or will you organize it according to the sources, with teachers, with learners, with principals? Okay, so you have to organize it, and you have to have good reasons for organizing it the way you do. But then we also have to integrate it, that is, putting it together. So how does the data about teachers relate to data about learners or from learners and principals? So we need some sort of cross-cutting strategy, and that might be in the form of narratives or themes or categories that we can use across. Right. And then we have to examine it, so a close scrutiny of the data. Right. And then that might involve, in the process of examining it, then we might begin to link it to concepts. Okay. So how does these data relate to the key concepts you're using in your study? Right. So, for example, if you're looking at maths educators and their teaching methods, right, then maybe method is one of your key concepts. How does the data link to that key concept? How does it link to the broad trends and themes, and what kind of generalizations can you begin to make? And then you'll use that interpretation perhaps to improve our understanding, to expand theory, to advance knowledge. So that's the overall purpose of your data analysis and interpretation. Okay. And you see I've put some arrows underneath there. And what I'm suggesting is that it's not just a linear process. Okay, so you don't just take your data, analyze it, interpret it, and then conclude. You're going backwards and forwards a lot. Right. So you might examine and analyze data and begin to thematize it, and then you find, well, I'm thinking about another theme's beginning to suggest itself. Let me go back to the data and see if that theme resonates with the data. So you see there can be a kind of a recursive relationship, which means going backwards and forwards between the data and the analysis and the interpretation. So it's not just linear steps. You're always going backwards and forwards. Okay. So does that make sense? If you look at that pattern, would you agree with Newman's definition? If you think about your own processes of data analysis, those who are at that stage, can you see your process fitting in with this? Okay. Okay. So I think that's a useful framework, and we can always come back to it and adjust it as we continue. Right, so what are qualitative data? We talked about that. Non-numerical, so words, images, artifacts, not numbers. Just have a look. Here's an example of qualitative datum. Right, here we've got a photo. And quite often the visual is quite powerful because you see things which you might not see, say, in a written account. And who of you are using are any of you using photos in your data? Okay, great. Yeah. Photos also really interesting when you compare different situations, because often you see things. When you read, you're reading in a kind of linear way, but when you look at a photo, you see the data simultaneously. So you have a different experience of data. Okay. So if you just look at that photo, I mean, what strikes you? I mean, what are the kinds of things that are coming out for you there? Overcrowded class. Okay. Right. So we've got a lot of what? How do you see that? What tells you that it's overcrowded?
If you think of this, if the fast rows view.
Yes.
At the back, there are students just standing.
Okay.
In front.
Yes.
Closer view, the students are sitting chairs in front.
Okay, right. So that observation, we could begin to say, well, that looks like a code or a theme that we might use. Whether or not it's the classroom is overcrowded, or the number of learners in the classroom, right? So that once you've observed that, you could begin to develop a theme or a category for analyzing it, relating to, say, student numbers. Anything else that strikes you from that one? Yeah.
The eyes, different people are looking in very different directions.
Okay,
so
right.
Sort of
Yes.
attention spans.
Yes, good.
Distractions or things like that.
Okay. Yes. So focus of attention, that might be a theme you could use that's coming out of this photo. Yes?
Some seem younger than others, or just in terms of what you can see.
Yes. Okay. So again, we might have different ages in the same classroom there. So we might look at the learners, but there's different aspects of the learners we might look at. Okay, age, perhaps gender, maybe dress. Right. So you can see that the people are dressed in different ways there. Hey?
So could that relate to the social issue of poverty?
Yeah. Okay. So you see how that specific analysis of this photograph, we might begin to link it to some of these broader concepts. So if you remember when we were looking at that, we said connect data to concepts. So poverty might be a concept that we're connecting it to. Okay.
Because then you could also look at the environment, the sort of physical environment.
Yes.
There's a desk with a freeze block on it, and the actual classroom, and the paint and the windows.
Yes.
The physical
Okay.
environment.
So the physical environment, the actual infrastructure, the windows, the desks, the chairs, all of that kind of stuff could be another focus or theme that we look at. Okay, and again, that could relate to broader issues. Right. So I think you're getting the sense that we can analyze photographs as well. Just have a look at this one here. Okay, sorry, that one is not as clear, but can you see that? Okay. Okay, sorry, it's not. So you see, we were starting to generate some themes from the first photograph, and we'd call that inductive analysis, where the themes are coming from the data. Okay, so then we'd say, now let's see if we can use the same kinds of themes with another photograph. So we had one around the learners, their gender, age, clothing, and so on. Would that one apply, do you think? Well, we do have learners there. Eh?
Yeah.
So even though the learners are very different, we can use the same kind of categories to analyze it. Okay? So we can still look at it. Who are the learners? What is their gender? What kind of age are they? How are they dressed? Right. And that would begin to reveal patterns which we might compare with other photographs. Okay. Yes?
I think a broad focus will be a provision of education.
Okay, right. Okay, that's interesting.
Definitely.
Yes. So in a way, what you've done is you've looked at the specific data around learners, how they dress, the desks and tables, and then beginning to move to broader categories of analysis. And I think that's part of the process of data analysis, is that you start, one way is to start very specifically developing codes and categories, and then to link to broader concepts, say like poverty, and then even broader cross-cutting concepts like provision of education. And then that would link to the idea of how do you link it to improving education? The third stage of things that we had. Is it the type of education? Right. You notice if you look at the previous photo. What in terms of materials or learning materials? What did you see? What did you notice there? It's very little, eh? So there seem to be a few papers or books, maybe a ruler or a pen. There's some kind of board at the back. I think it's a pin board. Okay, and then when we look at this one here, then it's very different, eh? So we can also work backwards. We can say, okay, we look at this. It strikes us they're using laptops, eh? Right. So then we might say, okay, they've got laptops. Let's go back to the previous one and think about it in terms of learning materials. Right. So as you're going along, you can generate new themes and then apply them to the previous data. And so that's why I'm saying it's a kind of recursive process, a continuous process of generating meaning from your data. Okay. And of course, this is quite a familiar sight in South Africa, where we have these huge inequalities in educational provision. And that might be another theme that comes out. One of the big themes, like poverty, inequality, might be something that comes out of the data. Okay, so you're getting the idea. So qualitative data analysis using non-numerical methods, focusing on themes, patterns, relations. It focuses on what the data means, or the data mean. a meaning-making activity that seeks to interpret the data. As I said, it's a continuing process that can occur simultaneously with data collection. I think that's worth considering as well, especially if you're doing qualitative research. As you're collecting the data, you can start thinking about the themes that are emerging from the data. Have some of you used that approach? Okay, so we call that continuous qualitative data analysis. So it's going on while you're collecting the data. Now, couldn't you say, well, first you should collect the data first and then analyze it? What's the point of analyzing the data as you're collecting it?
It's fresh in your head.
Okay,
And
right.
you sort of write things down, like after an observation, for example, you might just write things down that you didn't think of in that situation while you were observing, but the minute you get home, you remember things, and it's right there, and you start seeing patterns because it's very fresh.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So you've got that immediacy. You're close to the data, and then so it has that advantage of immediacy. Also, you can begin to use your analysis as you're going forward, right? So you begin to say, well, I've started to see these patterns. Now, as I'm interviewing the next person or observing the next classroom, let me see if those patterns are there as well, or if there are different kinds of patterns. So you're developing the picture cumulatively as you're advancing through your research. Okay, so that's one way of doing it, and that's quite common in qualitative research. Right. In quantitative research, you tend to collect the data and then analyze it as two quite distinct phases. Yes?
I also found that with interviews, I then started almost focusing, honing in on specific questions more than others.
Yes.
I started being more aware of certain questions and responses.
Okay.
And how, and started seeing where the responses were very slim on the ground, and maybe that question wasn't perhaps a good question, or
Yes.
it's just not appropriate for most of the people in that context.
Okay,
But
right.
I just found that.
Yes. And so why did you begin to hone more on certain questions than others?
For me, it also became more focused in that direction.
Yes.
And I started taking my attention more in that direction than in perhaps other ways.
Okay. So in a way, you're beginning to build an interpretation of the data, which would draw you more to certain questions than others, as you're developing your analysis and interpretation and beginning to make meaning of the data. Yes. Okay. So that's great. Right. We've talked about that it's systematic, an approach that includes many different methods. I've mentioned that as well. A very active and careful reading and rereading of data. So I have said that this process can be inductive, right? So that means the themes or categories come from the data themselves, right? And you're developing those by looking at the data carefully. But you can also do deductive data analysis. Can anyone tell us what do we mean by that? Or are some of you adopting that approach? Yes?
That you first, for instance, create a theoretical or framework
Yes.
that
Yeah.
you got from the literature or connected from the literature.
Yes.
And then with those concepts, try to make meaning of the data that you
Okay, great. Thank you. So deductive, you start with your theory or your questions, and you use that to help you analyze the data. Okay, so that would be. You remember we talked about that a few sessions ago. Theory first. Do you remember that? So if you have a theory first approach to research, then you develop your theoretical and analytical frameworks, and then you'll use them to analyze the data. And in a way that you then testing whether the data confirms the theory or modifies the theory or challenges the theory. Right. So your data analysis procedure could be inductive or deductive. Okay. Right. I'm just going to give you a minute to talk to the person next to you. are you thinking of adopting a deductive or inductive analytical strategy, or will you use a bit of both? Okay, let me just give you a minute to talk about that. Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Yeah, so we won't have time for me to ask each of you about your data analysis strategy, but just so you get the idea that there is a choice there. So if it's inductive, you're starting with the data, you're generating codes and themes from the data, then you're looking at relations and patterns, interpreting it, and then it can lead to some theory work. So you might then generate some kind of theory or concepts from your analysis, but that comes at the end, right, of the process. Whereas deductive analysis, you start with the theory. Okay? So you generate a theoretical framework. Remember, we talked about that a couple of months ago. You're drawing on theories that are relevant to your particular topic, and then from those theories, you work out an analytical framework. So that's how you're going to analyze the data. So it could be key concepts, which you transform into codes and so on. Then you apply that to the data, and then from that process, you might generate, then be able to say something about whether the theory is relevant or not. Okay. So see, it's the other way around. Okay. Did any of you say you're using both? Okay. Can you tell us? Would you tell us a bit about that? If you, how do you go about using both inductive and deductive?
Because like with the deductive one, it's like when you are asking, it helps you. Let's say when you are using the theory or the research question, they sort of guide you on what you can produce with things using that.
Okay.
And then
good.
as you are in the inductive one,
Yes.
you realize that like when you are during the interview, there's certain themes that come out stronger.
Yes.
So using both, once you
Yes.
have like you use your research questions, for example, or your theory to break down the themes. Now, when you're busy with the interviews, there are certain themes that also come out, and then it helps you now.
Yes.
Structure and restructure and put everything into. It's like a puzzle that you
Yes.
need to see which one fits where.
Okay.
So for me, it helps using both.
Okay, good. Thank you. Right. So I think that's also a strategy you can use when you're developing codes to analyze the data. Those codes could come from your research questions, because you are trying to use the data to answer your questions. Right. So that'll help you if you say, well, what are the key concepts in my questions? And then you use those concepts as lenses through which to look at the data. And those concepts might also come from your theoretical framework, and then you blend them into an analytical framework. But then, as you say, as you're looking at the data, you might find that there are other things emerging from the data. And then you can combine those themes and develop perhaps a list of codes that are drawing both on your questions and theory as well as your data. And that would be combining the inductive and deductive. So the way that you do it depends a lot on the purpose of your research, okay, your research paradigm, your methodology, and so on. And so you have to have good reasons for the strategy that you adopt to do your data analysis. Okay, right. So that's the key point. You can do it in different ways. There's no right or wrong way, but it must be appropriate for your particular purpose and your your approach and your methodology and so on. Okay, and we'll come back to that later on in today, where you'll have a chance to think more about that. Okay. Right. So I think we've covered this. Why do we do data analysis? To understand and interpret the data, to make sense of the data in relation to the research purpose and questions, to justify conclusions systematically. All right. So you're able to, if you've got certain conclusions about your topic and answers to your questions, you have to be able to justify that from the data. So the data analysis helps you to build an argument from your data that will help you to justify your conclusions. Right. To ensure that findings have a strong methodological basis. Okay, so those are reasons for doing it. Then how do we do it? Right, so this is quite a useful framework from Burke, Johnson, and Christensen. You see they have interpretation at the center, which is interesting. So they're saying interpretation is a continuous type of process. So you see there you've got data collection and then data entry and storage. So that's about organizing your data. Segmenting, coding, and developing category systems. So that's about integrating and examining your data, right? In terms of Newman, the way Newman talks about it. Right. And then identifying relationships, themes, patterns, hierarchies, all of those kinds of things, making the connections. Right. So that's a really important part of it, and that might be linking it to concepts and theories that you've been using. And then you can present that in different ways. You can construct diagrams. See, the way we constructed a diagram from Newman's ideas, right? A kind of a flow chart type of idea. Or you can use arrows. Sometimes it's nice to present a visual representation of your analysis because it brings things together. You can see it kind of simultaneously. And there's many different ways of doing that. When you're using quantitative data, you can use things like charts, tables, pie charts and diagrams and so on. In qualitative data, you might use flow charts, okay, or maps, sort of mind maps, which show the relation of different patterns. But you can be quite creative in doing it. Eh? And then corroborating and validating results. You see how the arrows go round and round, because that you might go back to some further data collection because you want to check certain things and deepen certain things. So it's the continuing process. Yeah. Does that diagram make sense to you? There's quite a lot in there, but it shows a kind of a sequence of activities and shows how they relate to each other, but that it's not a linear process with a beginning and an end. It is recursive. Okay. Don't worry if you don't get it. You need a bit more time to look at that, but I'll send it to you and you can look at it in more detail. Eh? Okay. Right. I'm going to. Yeah. I just want to mention that data analysis doesn't happen just in one sitting. Often you have to take your time and go through it several times. Go through the data several times. So here Crabtree and Miller talk about 5 readings of data, and which I think is quite a useful way to think about it. So they say the first reading, I just read without preconceptions and just look at key themes, emotions, and surprises. Right. So that's where you just have a look at the data. You just read through it, and you kind of open to it. Then the second reading, I specifically read for those themes. Right. So the things you noticed in the first reading, you go back and focus a bit more specifically on those things. I note the evidence that supports those themes and is against them. I'm looking to better understand. Right. So that's almost like taking it to a deeper level. The third reading, I go back to see if there's anything else important that I missed. Okay, so it's also important to look for what for what you didn't notice. Right, so you're checking yourself, because sometimes your first and second readings will, you'll see particular very strong themes that stand out for you, but you might not notice other things because you're so excited about those themes, because you see, that links to my question, right? And then you forget about some of the other stuff there, which might be not as loud or explicit, but it's still there and it's important. So that the third reading can help you to get to that stuff. The fourth reading, I force myself to come up with 1, 2, or 3 alternative understandings. Okay, so now you're beginning to challenge your interpretation. Are there other ways of understanding this data? Okay, because you initially jump on one interpretation, but then can you begin to perhaps contest that interpretation, and are there other ways of seeing it or interpreting it? Okay, so that would be a fourth reading. And then the fifth reading, if I come up with discrepancies in the fourth reading, are there ways to link them together? Right. So do you see how each of those readings has a different moment of interpretation or level of interpretation? Okay, and it's easy to be seduced by the data. So it's easy to say, you read the data, you see it there, that's what it means. Right. So as scholars, we have to be careful of that, because the obvious is not necessarily the most important. Right. And it's useful to give yourself a chance to go back to the data, look at it again, test your interpretations, think of other possible interpretations, and then see how you might relate those different interpretations together. And then you get a richer, more complex picture of the data than you would if you just did, say, 1 and 2. Okay, so I find this quite a useful thing to use to discipline your data analysis in a way, to discipline yourself as you do data analysis. Okay. I think what's useful about this also is it's a way of challenging your own presuppositions. Okay? Because in a way, I know when we develop research questions, we often have a sense of what the answers are going to be, or what the answers should be, right? And then we look at the data and say, yes, they're answering in the way that I think they should. Okay, but then that's not necessarily a comprehensive way of doing it, because you might find, looking at it again, you find stuff that is a different kind of answer, or maybe even challenging your own assumptions and surprising you. So the data analysis process should be able to surprise you, showing you things that you didn't expect. And you have to be open to being surprised. And maybe it's uncomfortable because you're saying, well, maybe my assumptions weren't so valid. Okay, and maybe I need to listen to the data and challenge my own assumptions. And that's part of being a scholar. Right. Yes. Sorry, someone. Yes, go ahead.
I was a strong proponent of phonetics and phonetics.
Okay.
Then I realized, but this is not the all and everything. And now I'm reading the new literacy style, and I must say, I'm challenging myself now, coming from the strong phonics background.
Yes.
So that's what you're saying.
Yes, absolutely.
We surprise ourselves.
Yes.
We realize
Yeah.
there's some other stuff out there that's not what, it doesn't agree with, somewhere in your heart it doesn't agree with you.
Yes.
But this is how you've grown up, this is what you've learned, this is what you thought is the right way. And
Yes.
now all of a sudden you hear things that's shocking.
Yes.
But still very valid when you really continue reading it.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and I think I think you've raised an important point about you talk about affect, emotion, right? And that's such a central part of learning, and often we try and separate those things. You say, the mind is one thing and the emotions is another thing, and we must keep them apart. But often the way we learn is very closely linked to how we feel about things. So you're saying you had quite a strong attachment, say, to a phonics approach, and then maybe you did some investigation or observed things or read things that began to challenge that, which is uncomfortable, right? So often learning is an uncomfortable process, and I think research is all about learning. So in a way, we have to be prepared to manage our discomfort. Right, and in a way, these 5 steps are one way of doing that. Okay, yes.
I'm just thinking too on what you said when I presented my proposal. You said a bit about your own bias.
Yes. Yeah.
Someone said to me a year ago that you might be stressed out about the literature review. I actually found the data analysis process as even more draining.
Okay.
Because yes, the literature is out there, but when someone who in my research, I'm interviewing and observing teachers and having been a teacher myself on the very same subject.
Yes.
You might miss certain things because you've
Yes.
done it for so long.
Yes.
You wanted to see
Absolutely.
That is what I found really challenging.
Yes.
To take that hat off and just actually step back and be just the observer.
Yes. I think. Thank you for raising that, because I think that's central. It's a central tension within educational research. That typically educational researchers are also practitioners, or and you have, as a practitioner, say as an educator or as a lecturer, you've got very strong ideas about education, what should be the case, how people should learn, how you should teach. Then as a researcher, you have to recognize that your position has changed. You can't just impose your ideas as a practitioner onto the research, because then you're not going to be you're going to be blind to certain things, or you're going to distort certain things. So thank you for raising that. I think you have, and it's uncomfortable, and it's something that you never stop learning to do. Okay, and then if it works well, the research begins to inform you as a practitioner, not just the other way around, which I think is a really good dialogue. Okay. Yes. Go ahead. Yes.
It sort of borders on what was already raised, but just slightly different. So. For example, when I was observing some teachers, and then I'd have a chat with them afterwards, and so something like learner-centered classrooms, learner-centered teaching would come up, and they would say they were doing a very learner-centered lesson or whatever, and in my mind it wasn't.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily that I have a strong sense of what a learner-centered lesson should be, but I sat there doubting myself, thinking, but you just stood in front of the class talking to the students, so how's
Yes.
that learner-centered? And when I asked the question, so could you tell me more about how you made it learner-centered? It was a slightly different take, but again, I kept thinking, oh, that's still not, it's still not quite there.
Yes, yes.
So, I mean, how's that? Because I feel that perhaps in a situation like that, I don't feel like I'm being biased. I'm trying to open up and say to them, explain to me how it
Yes.
was learner-centered.
Yes.
But I still think that they're wrong.
Yes.
You know, in
Yes.
a sense.
Yeah,
I still
yeah.
think what they did was not what the literature says is learner-centered.
Yes.
So what do you do with something like that? I mean, that's
Yes, yeah, I think, and I think that's very common, because often there is this discrepancy between policy and action. Between what people say and what they do. So I think as a researcher, you don't deny your own preconceptions or your own understandings, but you don't impose them. I think that's the important thing, right? So I think the challenge to you would be, why are they saying it's learner-centered? How do they understand it? Where is their understanding coming from? How do they construct that understanding? What is the basis for their understanding? And then, once you understand that, you can bring in the other perspectives to engage with that. Not to say that you're wrong or they are wrong, but it's about deepening your understanding of that, right? Rather than judging it. The judgment can come in your discussion when you're drawing on literature, but you have to be careful of imposing a judgment on the data, which will stop you understanding the data.
Yes,
Yeah.
because that's what I'm worried about. I would kind of feel very judgy doing it.
Yes.
And then I think, it's going to take me away from the data. And
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then you have to just recognize your roles as well. So you say to yourself, okay, practitioner, be quiet now. I'm the researcher. Okay, you can speak to me later. Okay, so it's recognizing your different roles. And not to say that practitioner role is not valuable, because it's part of who you are. But you do have to separate them and allow them to engage in a dialogue, rather than the one shouting all the time. Okay, yes.
Because I think that's quite common. Like, I also came across, I had the same problem, because as the discussion was going on, I was now thinking, because like having my data and having experienced that, then I sort of asked myself, now where do I position myself when I'm going to analyze this data?
Yes.
So how do I bring everything and have that, how am I going to interpret this and, not having my voice coming out strong in it, but having the participant's voice,
Yes.
without imposing my own idea or influence with the theory. So
Yes.
how am I going to combine all these three things
Yes.
and have it speak in my research? So I was sort of like also struggling
Yes.
with how I'm going to put it down in the analysis.
Yes. Okay, that's great. That's a really good question, and but let's not try and answer it, because I don't think it's easy to answer it. I think you answer it by doing it. So I want us to have a look at a bit of data now, okay? And then let's see if we can begin to do a bit of analysis, and this will be thematic content analysis. So I'm going to give you an extract from an interview. I was interviewing the director of a literacy organization, and I was asking him about how they worked. It was a family literacy organization that worked with women in a rural area. Okay, sorry, can you just grab one? I'll come back to that. Okay, has everybody got that? Right. So I haven't given you the whole interview. I just took a little bit where the director, PH, is talking about how the literacy organization works, its methodology. Right? Let me just read it, and as I'm reading, just think about what are the kinds of themes that are coming out here, because we're looking at the content now. Okay. So I asked the question, okay, that's interesting. You've got a kind of built-in outreach that the members go and visit homes. Yes, the idea was that it's like pay your skill forward. So they've been given a requisite skill set, and then we then developed a manual, and we're busy developing a second one that we are piloting with our group. And then the group members take this literacy skill, this family literacy skill set, because it's based around the integrated management of childhood illnesses. So there is that whole component. It's based around the importance of reading and basically parents involving themselves in the education of their children. So even if they're illiterate, to sit with kids, and we have umzali nengane, parents and the child, where the parent would keep a journal or book with kids. Even if they are illiterate, they can draw a picture with the kid, and the kid can draw a picture, or the kid can read to the parent. That's really what it is. So the Kulisa Abantwana home visiting is taking this health education, and then obviously the importance of reading and engaging your child. And now the recent one that we started developing is that psychosocial component. We got parents, we call it the journey, parents going on the journey with their kids, explaining about the lead up to their birth, and they develop a little journal for the kids. Right? So he's explaining this process where the women would meet together, develop a particular literacy skill, and then go into the community and teach that skill to another family. So that's the idea of the family literacy. He's just explaining how that works. So I said, so are you saying that these adults, would you call them learners or participants? What do you call them? We call them participants, but they are learners. A prerequisite is to be able to be a home visitor. Is that you have to have attended the literacy sessions, because that is where the training takes place. So the literacy component of what we do is not just functional literacy, it's based around the needs of each group individually. So we developed units that the facilitator will do an assessment with the group to see what they need to learn, what they feel is necessary, and our material is designed around that. So it's not like a top-down type of system. We come with the unit and they have to do whatever they think is relevant or not. So it's a balance, because you can't allow them to be completely engaged in that material development side of things, but they decide on the pace, they decide on the content of what you include and what you leave out of the unit that we've developed. So I say that's amazing, eh? It's so different to many adult centers where it's just imposed, but there's an element of negotiation. It says yes, it's based a lot around Freirean principles, where they embark on the whole reflect process. It seems to work well. Okay. So that's description. Now, just as you've been looking at reading that, so that's like the first reading of the data. Right. So as you were reading that, I was asking you, did you see any kind of themes beginning to come out? So have a look at it again now, and see if you can notice any themes. The theme would be an idea that's coming out. If you see something that's like an idea, just underline it. And in the margin you can write, you could just even give it an initial. So say, for example, writing is a key idea. You could just underline it and put W in the margin. Okay? And then that would be the first kind of stage of beginning to code the data and find some themes. So I'll give you a chance to do that. Wow. Some of you are going fast. Okay, I'm handing you out a sheet, but don't worry about the sheet. First do your stuff, and then we'll look at it. drawing from the literature. Right? So they're not talking explicitly. So that would be which is fine. Okay, I think you're getting the idea. You see how we went through a first reading where we just read it together, and then you've done a second reading where you're starting to say what are the kinds of themes. I noticed perhaps a few themes in the first reading. Then you go back and see and check if there are those themes. Then you're starting to give them words. Like you're saying, well, maybe there's a theme around reading. Or parental involvement. Some of you saw that one. Literacy. What other ones did you have?
Apprenticeship.
Apprenticeship. Okay, interesting. Yeah.
Integration.
Okay, so you're starting to make sense of the data. Okay, and then one way of doing that is you can begin to generate themes and codes for those themes, and that's what I've done. If you have a look at this sheet that I've given you out. So you might look at this particular interview, and then you say from the data, I can identify some key themes. So those would be those ones in the left-hand column there. So I've got support, groups, programs, facilitators, learners, and so on. Right? And then you see how I've assigned each of those themes a code. So by code I mean just a letter. Right, so S for support, G for groups, and so on. If you have one that's more than one with the same letter, you just say methods is ME, materials is MA. Okay. And then you might find that there's certain sub-themes that are connected to that main theme. So say, and for support, I saw there was family support. So then I call that SF. Academic support, skills support, parental involvement, and so on. And then code them appropriately. And then, so you can develop I call this a coding sheet. You develop your coding sheet as you're looking at the data. So you can keep on adjusting it and modifying it to make it fit. And then you might find, well, these codes are very similar. Maybe I'm going to combine them. So for example, perhaps you'd say literacy and reading. Maybe because you find that you're coding all of them the same way, then you might combine them. Okay, or you might not, depending on what you decide. Or you see I've got parental involvement. Maybe that would be a theme. I've got it as a sub-theme there. Maybe I say there's so much about parental involvement. I'm going to put it as a theme, and then I'll see if there's sub-themes under parental involvement. So you can play around and modify it until you're satisfied that you've got a coding sheet that's going to help you to analyze the data. Okay. Does that make sense? Right. And then you analyze all your data using these codes, and then you begin to organize it so you can create a word file for each of the themes, and then you put the sentences or phrases from the different interviews or observations under that particular word file. So you'll have, say you've got parental involvement as your theme, then you've got all the stuff around parental involvement in that same file. And you have to make sure you know where it comes from. So you'd say interview 1, interview 2, so you can cross-reference it. Then you begin to see what is all of my data saying about parental involvement from the director, the facilitators, the participants, and is there a pattern there that I can see about parental involvement? Then you do the same with, say, family or reading or whatever it is. So that would be inductive analysis. The data is showing you what the pattern is. Okay. some of you were doing a bit of deductive analysis. So you were saying, I can use some ideas from my reading, right? So I think you were using the idea of conscientization, because you saw Paulo Freire, right? So you could say, this is the theory. Let's see how does the data resonate with the theory. So if I understand Paulo Freire's theory, I can begin to use some of his ideas like dialogue, praxis, conscientization, the oppressed, those ideas, and generative codes, and then use that to analyze it. So, and that would be fine. It just depends on what your purpose and your questions are.
Also apprenticeship.
Yes, that's right. You used the word apprenticeship. That was interesting. So you got that idea from, say, from your reading, or then you was. How did you see that idea of apprenticeship?
I was really thinking of the hairdresser.
Okay.
And I was thinking, I went to the hairdresser once and I saw all the assistants using the wigs to do the styles.
Okay, right.
And then I thought of, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Levin Wenger's theory.
Levin Wenger, yeah.
Of the, the tailors.
Yes, yes.
And then I looked at the hairdresser and I thought,
okay.
Phew, it's very similar, although it's very different.
Yes, yes, that's great. So that would be another possible theory you could use, which would be communities of practice, which comes out of Levin Wenger. So that might be an analytical framework that you use to analyze the data. And then you draw on some of the key ideas from Levin Wenger, such as situated learning, apprenticeship, what's it, peripheral participation, insider, outsider, all of those terms, and then use that to understand the data. Okay.
So how many of these codes would be in your initial interview question? Or does that just...
Initial interview questions?
Yeah, because obviously you don't have one...
I wouldn't have I'd have a sheet of questions, which would be your interview schedule, and then you use that to gather the data. And then once you've gathered the data, you look at it and generate another sheet, which would be the codes. Okay. There might be a link between the two, because you might draw some of your codes from the questions, because that's what you're interested in finding out, and that would be more a deductive data analysis.
In terms of the whole process you describe here and with the codes and everything, is it best to use a tool like Atlas or something?
Yes. There's some really good qualitative analysis tools like Atlas or Vivo. I think it just depends. If you've got, sometimes those tools are really good if it's a big, if you've got lots and lots of data. Then it's good for managing the data and it does some of the thematic work for you. If you've got a more limited amount of data, it's quite a lot of work to put all of it in, to input all of it. So, I think, I find if it's a small scale project, it's better just to do it like this, because you can just sort of do it manually. But if you're doing a big research project with multiple participants, then something like Vivo or Atlas is great, because then it's pulling all the data together using the same codes. Yeah, so it's up to you really, as long as you've got good reasons for choosing. Okay. Right, so you get we haven't gone through the whole process yet, but I've just tried to give you a taste of it, of how you would do it. Can you see how you might relate this to your data analysis? Okay. So this would be called content analysis or thematic content analysis. There's different names for it. Some people call it thematic analysis. Some people call it content analysis, or some people call it textual analysis. But basically, we're looking at the content and looking for themes from the content, and then coding those themes, and then bringing together the data on different themes so that we can see what the content says about those themes. And that can be very useful because it helps you to bring together all the data that's relevant to particular themes in your research questions. Okay. So when you're trying to answer your question, you go back to the relevant themes and see what the data is saying, and then organize it and write it up using the data to illustrate your argument. Okay. So it's a long process. I'm just giving you a little snapshot of the process. Okay. How are we doing for time? Okay, so we're doing fine. Are there any questions about that? Okay, who of you are thinking of using thematic content analysis in your data analysis? Okay, right, so quite a few of you. Do you have a sense of how you could go about it now? Okay. So, as I said, it could be inductive, generating the codes from the data. It could be deductive, where you generate the codes from your questions and your theories. Or it could be a combination, as you explained. And all of those are legitimate ways of doing it. You just have to provide a rationalization. Why are you doing it and the way you're doing it? How does it fit in with your purpose and questions and your whole research approach? Okay. Quite often, doing a thematic content analysis is a good place to start, even if you decide to use other methods as well. So you might decide to do a thematic content analysis and then also do a discourse analysis or a narrative analysis or some other kind of analysis. So it complements other methods of data analysis because it gives you a good idea of what's there, right? What is the content saying? And then that'll help you with whatever other kind of analysis you do. Okay. So it's a kind of basic, it's the basis of qualitative analysis, I'd say, content analysis. So what we'll do is we'll have a tea break now, and then after that we'll move into discourse analysis, and then Professor van der Walt is going to do that. And discourse analysis really takes a slightly different position and looks at the social use of language, right? And how it's located within a particular way of using language, and she'll talk about that. And then we'll look at narrative analysis. And I'm going to show you another extract from someone's life history, and we'll talk about different ways of analyzing that kind of data. So let's have a, say, 20-minute tea break, and we'll start again about 10 to 11. Okay.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Professor Christa van der Walt. I'm going to talk a little bit about discourse analysis and how you can use it as a tool in your research, and also try and give you some indication of how you can report on your analysis, because that's often a problem. It might be relatively easy to analyze a particular text, but then when you get to reporting on your analysis, that could be where some problems might creep in. So I'm going to try to give you a framework and also some tips into how to report and how to analyze the data. Right, so when I talk about discourse analysis, I'm going to, a proper discourse analysis or a proper conversation analysis would require quite extensive linguistic tools. So if you're not in the field of linguistics or applied linguistics, then you might still be able to do a discourse analysis, but it won't be as in-depth as a linguist might do it. So what I'm presenting is kind of discourse analysis light, in the sense that, with what we all know about language, we can still get into these texts in depth. Okay, so I'm looking at discourse analysis in a critical theory framework. So normally when we do discourse analysis, it's not merely a matter of reporting what is there, but also looking more critically at what the issues and the problems are, especially in terms of power relationships, and how power might be exercised or how it might be subverted, etc. So for me, I normally use discourse analysis in the critical theory kind of way. So critical discourse analysis is what I would do. You need to check with your supervisor, obviously, in which theory or which tradition he would like you to do the discourse analysis, because there are different ones. Okay, so that's just a quote by Jorgensen and Phillips, which you can have a look at. And I'm sure these ideas are not new to you. The idea that we create our own realities by using specific language, and that there really isn't an objective truth out there, and that we create truths and we interpret the world in terms of our own mindsets and our own points of view. So it's anti-essentialist in the sense that we don't say, for example, that there is, let's use a fairly safe topic, there is just two sets of gender. So we don't ascribe a specific characteristics only to one gender and another set of characteristics to another gender. So in that sense, we don't essentialize. We don't say that there are, this is what a woman looks like, or this is what a woman is, etc. And then also it links up with the idea of relativism, that we always see our own point of view relative to other points of view. That you are not so a prisoner of your own culture and of your own points of view, that you cannot see it relative to other points of view. So that's just the point of departure of a critical discourse analysis. Right. As I said, this is often a linguistic, it's often done in some depth in linguistics. And what's been happening these past few years is that we're not only looking at utterances or at sentences, we're going beyond that. We're looking at the context, we're looking at what people do with language. And we have Austin to thank for that. He developed the theory of speech acts, which is something that is so obvious nowadays. It's like, we can't think of relationships and psychology without thinking of Freud. And in the same, Austin has had the same impact on linguistics. We almost can't think of language without thinking of what we do with language, the acts that we do with language. Like if we say, I do, it's not just, yes, I'm doing this, it's, I'm saying yes to a relationship, I'm saying yes to a convention, I'm saying yes to some kind of a formalized agreement. So I'm getting married. I'm sorry, it's not just the words, it's an act, it's something that we do. And the same with requests, etc. So there are many, many of these kinds of acts that we do with language. So that we see in the analysis as well when we get there. And then, of course, from the early 20th century to the mid-20th century, there were people like Wittgenstein, Derrida, Foucault, all those people who actually say that our whole world is constituted by language, and it's known as the linguistic turn. And I think it's also one of those things that's so obvious now that we almost cannot imagine our lives without those ideas. Okay, that's just some background. Where we are is the link between education and linguistics. So educational linguistics, but discourse analysis is also used by non-linguists, and in a way that is not so rigorous and finely grained in terms of analysis of the language itself. And the problem then is that if you don't look very closely at the language that people use, that you lose some of the rigor of the analysis. And I'm getting extremely worried by views like, I'm doing qualitative discourse analysis, because it's so much easier than doing quantitative studies and so on. And I think to do a proper discourse analysis and to do a proper qualitative analysis is just as difficult, if not more difficult, than quantitative analyses where you have a statistician to help you. In this case, it's only you and it's all on you. So you're the ones doing the analysis. So be very careful that people don't talk about your research like that. Okay. So what is discourse analysis and what do all discourse analysts agree on? And that's just one of the many quotes that you can have a look at quickly. So what we're looking at is, in the tradition of John Austin, we're looking at social action in natural data, non-literally understood, because in the same way that somebody says I do, it doesn't mean that they are doing something. Well, of course they're doing something, but it's we're understanding it in the context, but also we understand natural language in its co-text, and that's where some of the rigor comes from. So does anybody know what the difference is between context and co-text? So the co-text would be the words immediately following a particular concept. So when we're looking at a sentence and we're looking at concepts like clarity, for example, we would look at different forms of the word clarity, clear, clearly, etc. But we would also look at the text surrounding it, because sometimes we might find the word, but in the code text, it means something quite different from what we might have seen in other forms of that, other uses of that word. Okay, so remember that difference, context and code text. And just like with quantitative data, I think for many of us, you are all working teachers, and we all have an idea of how things should be done. So we enter into research maybe with some answers that we think the research should be showing us. So, and that's the one thing that data does. And data, whether it's qualitative data or quantitative data, we must always listen to the data. So that, the data speaks to us. We don't tell the data how to be, the data should speak to us. And that's where the rigor comes in. I want to show you some examples of what conversational and discourse analysis would look like if it were done by a linguist, just to make the distinction between a very finely grained analysis and the kind of more global analyses that we do in education. So this would be typical in an article on discourse analysis. I'm sorry, it's very faint, but you don't need the detail. It's just a set of symbols that people use to indicate how a conversation progressed. So you can see there are signs for shorter pauses and longer pauses. There's, for example, if somebody puts an H in the middle of a word, it means that there was some laughter when somebody said the word. So you can see in what detail they analyze these conversations. And of course, for a thesis, you can imagine that you can't have 15 interviews like this. It's impossible to analyze them at this level. So usually these kinds of studies would focus on maybe 3 or 4 excerpts from conversations to show particular issues. And this is what it would look like when you put it in your thesis. You would actually indicate every yay and ah that you have in the conversation. So unless you want to make a particular point about somebody maybe not being sure of what they want to say, this is not really something that you would put into your analyses, because this is, this goes into probably too much detail to be able to make a point about, say, the way teachers experience a specific concept in general. So these are more finely grained analyses. This is a typical example. So I was wondering, would you be in your office on Monday? And then there's a pause, by any chance? And then there's a 2-second pause, which is obviously too long in conversation, so there's nothing coming back. And then the person answers himself, probably not. So you can see what kinds of things you can get from a conversation analysis like that. But the point, of course, is not that we merely describe what's happening. The point is that we interpret what's happening. So I want to show you an example of a fairly difficult conversation between a doctor and a mother regarding the child's mental development, but I don't want to upset anybody. It's not graphic or terrible in any way, but I'm just saying. Okay, so this was the conversation. Can you just quickly read through that, please? Right, so the doctor is trying to give a very difficult message to the mother that the child needs to go into a special class. But he or she is constantly avoiding saying specifically what the what the results of the test were and what these results say about this specific child. So. And then the mother, of course, right at the end, she calls him on it. She says, but are you trying to tell me this? Okay, so if you were to report on this data, there are a number of things that you could say, depending, of course, on the focus of your study. So you could make points about how the doctor refers to the class rather than the individual. He says this class would be more suitable. He's deliberately avoiding using certain words. And of course, that's part of your analysis. It's not only about what is said, but it's also about how it is said and what is not said. So those are things that you would also look at in your analysis. And the way in which the doctor is trying to find the right word. So you could also make some kind of inference about how doctors are trained to actually deal with these difficult conversations, and maybe they're not giving the right strategies to verbalize these kinds of diagnoses. So yeah, it depends on the kinds of on the direction and the focus of your study, what you would be able, the conclusions that you would draw from that. Okay, so in education, we usually look at interviews, focus group discussions, and classroom observations. But we also often see, people using quantitative surveys, and then right at the end they would have an open-ended question. Are there any other issues that you want to raise? Or give us your general impression of this, that, and the other. So, and those open-ended kinds of questions often actually give you more information than the questionnaire itself. And these would typically be the the kind of data on which you would do an analysis. Either a plain thematic analysis or then a more finely grained discourse analysis. So there are different kinds of analyses, text analyses, open coding. I think that's what you've been doing in the previous session. Conceptual coding, you're looking for specific concepts and you want to see how they emerge in the data, like in policies or curriculum documents. And Miles and Huberman, they've created a specific kind of a diagram which explains the processes. I don't know, Professor Rule, have you maybe used this diagram? Okay, it basically just shows you the various steps. And I think the most important point about this is that you go through the data again and again and again. So it's not a matter of reading through it once and, yes, I think this is what they all seem to be saying. Because the minute you look at the data in more detail, you're going to find other issues that might not agree with that first impression. I think it's been shown that, for example, language teachers, when they mark, they often, the idea is that you get an impression of what the learner's mistakes are and you're going to address them in the next lesson. But research has shown that actually language teachers, they only remember the errors that the last learner made in the last paragraph. So that's not to say that those were general errors. And we tend to do the same when we look at the data once. So you need to go through it again and again. Okay, so what I've given you in handout 1 is also a kind of a diagram which helps you to say something about the text and frame the text in a specific way. So you would start with the context, so say something about the context in which the discourse or these texts was produced, the production process, so how was it a written response, were they recorded, did they type their responses, etc. The structure of the text, so how formal were the conventions that within which this text was produced. Was it a kind of a formal letter which has which you have to maintain a specific tone, you have to be formal, you have to be polite, etc. So to what extent would that limit the person producing the text? Then of course, how did you code the material? What are the categories or the themes? What are there any cultural references? And then a whole list of linguistic and rhetorical mechanisms, the interpretation and the presentation. So these are just some tools to help you once you've done your analysis to structure the way in which you report then on your analysis. And this also helps you with some steps in how the kinds of linguistic elements that you could look at. Right. Where am I now? I want you to look at the second handout that I gave you. This one. Okay, so here, this is actual real data produced by a master's student of mine, and he wanted to see to what extent teachers feel ready, teachers in the intermediate phase feel ready to teach different forms of writing. And so he had it was a plain quantitative study, it was a survey, and then at the end he had an open-ended question. So this is just a selection of the responses that I'm giving you, because obviously there were many, many, many. And as you can see, some people just wrote very briefly, some people wrote a lot. And as I said before, actually we got more information from this open-ended question than we got from all the other questions. So it's always a useful tool if you are comfortable doing the analysis of those kinds of questions. Right. So I would like you to read through this. I'm going to give you 10 to 15 minutes. I'll see how far you get. And I want you to read through it and see if you can find certain concepts and certain themes that seem to repeat throughout the data. And then I'll get back to you and we can look at some of the results. Right, so just you can work together or work individually, doesn't matter to me. Just have a look and, you know, underline, use different color pens or whatever to see if you can identify certain concepts that repeat. And please talk to each other. You really don't have to draw columns, you can do it whichever way you want. Okay. Let's get some first impressions. Obviously, I know you can't all, you can't do an in-depth analysis in 10 minutes. But maybe we can get a few ideas about what you think are the main issues. Yeah.
What stood out? Time. Everyone just brought up the whole concept of there's not enough time.
Exactly. But is that the only way in which time comes to the fore in this in those responses?
No, I think sometimes it's used as an excuse.
Yes, but let's just work with the concept of time for a minute. Yeah.
So there's different manifestations of time. So the time in class to deal with the students, but then there's time that's always rushed in the workshops, and there's time in terms of the teacher's experience.
Yes.
Different manifestations of those.
Exactly. Yeah. So you could have something like that there's not enough time, but there's also the issue of time in terms of experience, or not being exposed for long enough, which is also an issue of time.
Also, not enough time to do the research to establish the concepts.
Exactly. So it's not, you could have done a word search, and I'm going to talk about that later. You could have done a simple word search for time. And you would have picked up quite a lot already. But kind of a mechanical process like that would not have picked up the issues of experience. Or there's even one who makes a suggestion for how time should be structured in language teaching. I think she says something like a week for this and a week for that. That's also an issue of structure and of time. So in that sense, it's not just about there not being enough time. The whole issue of time takes on a different complex when you look at it from all the different perspectives. I don't know how many of you found clarity or something being clear as another issue in that text. I just want to show you. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to see it there. No. So for some other reason, I need to do something else in order to. I wanted to show you my text. You can, if you've got this electronically, of course you can use highlighting of different colors to show the different themes, and to also show different links between the themes. What did you see in terms of maybe things like using capitals or using inverted commas or things like that?
In instance number 4, that shows the frustration.
Yes. So there are different ways in which they can give emphasis to something, and using caps is one way of doing that. Is it still there now? Sorry. Right. There's another example. 11, yes. What can we say about 11?
The person felt very confident.
Yes. It can either be that, or they simply forgot the caps lock on. So we must think of, because normally if you wanted to emphasize, you wouldn't normally emphasize 2 sentences, so it could, but listen to me talking. I'm saying could, would, might, because we're not in their heads, we don't know. Yes.
I actually think this person said I did the training, and CAPS training is a big part of what teachers don't know. So for me, the fact that it's in capital letters, I kind of think that maybe that's what they wanted.
Yeah.
Us to know that they've actually done it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just saying that, there are different ways of seeing it.
Can I say something? I suppose it depends on the rest of the way they typed. So if everything was in capital letters,
Yeah.
then they decided to type the caps lock on.
Yes.
But if that specific sentence was in caps,
Yeah,
then
yeah,
it says something.
yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
That's super presented to the very good looking person presenting, so that is why I see.
You mean she might be more excited than she should be? Okay. I'm trying to think. Oh, yes. What about inverted commas? Nothing is working. Yeah. So why? Because inverted commas or italics usually they're an indication that you are you're placing some kind of a condition on the words themselves. So what could that mean then? That nothing is working.
To me, it means that she's not being very specific. You know, she's not actually, she's using a much broader term to talk about, instead of clarifying something.
Yeah.
It could either be just, you can't think of a better word at that time, or, yeah, I don't know, I think she's just not being specific about what's not working. And when she says nothing's not working, that working can have all sorts of connotations to it.
Yeah, in other words, it's it could be that she's exactly trying to say that it's on a variety of levels. Things are not going well.
Maybe she's saying that in a polite way, and it's not
Working. Yeah.
She's being polite about it instead of wanting to say what she really feels.
Yeah. Although if you look at the co-text, she also says teaching English in the Karoo can be a hellish experience. So she's not holding back. Okay. There was another one. The very first one, confused by curriculum 2005 in inverted commas. I think that's probably simply because it's a name. I'm not sure. I'm just saying. Okay, what kind of metaphors do these teachers use to explain what they think? Could you find any examples of images or comparisons or metaphors in the text? Being on track, certainly. Yeah.
I think number 70. I'm from the Karoo. It can be a hellish experience.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
On that mother tongue English learners.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's also just the way it says to build the house from the roof down.
Yes. Yes, I love that specific image. You know, that it feels to her as if they're not starting from the foundations up, they're trying to build from the roof down. Any others? There are quite a number of images to do with barriers or things that cause the learners to stumble or to, I mean in a metaphorical sense, so that they're experiencing hindrances in some way or barriers, or they are kept back by something that stands in their way. So those are all images that can help you clarify what's going on in the teachers in their minds. What's actually, how do they see this process? So it's not only what they say, it's also these images that they use. Writing gets pushed aside. It's a very physical way of explaining what happens to writing. Right.
Something that also stood out for me was the pronouns of I and we. So sometimes, and I think maybe it stood out for me because I've been thinking about the same thing with my analysis. So sometimes people feel like they're in a group. We
Yes,
use
yes.
caps.
Yeah.
We've done it this way in our school, but sometimes it's a very individualistic thing. I still need experience. I don't know how to do this, or whatever it was. I use my caps document, or I have not, they're very individualistic. And sometimes people don't use any pronoun at all. So, for example, but I suppose that would depend on the rest of the answers.
Yeah.
So in, where did I see? It's a number 11. I made a note of it now. I can't find it.
Well, if you just look at number 7, I have 26 years of experience. It's obviously a matter of pride. So, I make a point to study, to empower myself. So that's certainly a very individualistic way of looking at it. I use my CAPS document. Number 16, never had any workshops or seminars on them. Had to pick up on them myself. Although she doesn't use the personal pronoun I, she does refer to herself. Yeah. There's another one. As a first-year teacher, I still have a lot to learn. So you can also see the isolation in those, in that, it's me, and I don't know where to go. I don't know how to do things. Yeah, certainly. Yeah, that's a very good point. Okay, so we've looked at capital letters, inverted commas. We've looked at the metaphors that they use. But the final question is, did they actually answer the question? The question was, do you feel well prepared to teach and develop all the concepts demanded by CAPS for extended writing? Did they answer that question?
Sometimes no, but you can always extrapolate from what they say, whether they feel prepared or not, and would we be making too much of a leap by doing that? If there's innuendo that, this is difficult, or I'm struggling with this, but they're not outrightly saying, I don't feel well prepared.
Yeah. I think that if you look at this is now, knowledge that I have that you obviously don't have, but they were taken through a list of concepts that they had to say, whether they're familiar with this term, etc., concepts from the curriculum. And so this was kind of the final thing. And okay, let me first hear what you want to say. Yeah.
No, I'm just interested in what does well prepared mean?
There
would be do you feel well prepared to teach? So, is someone well prepared would
to teach that specific aspect of the curriculum, yes.
So many workshops, and therefore you should be well prepared. You've got resources, you've got material,
Yeah.
And then others say, well, I've got my experience, and I would have just needed one workshop. So that there's just for me personally about what does well prepared mean.
Absolutely.
They would have their own interpretations of, okay, now I feel well prepared, and therefore.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah.
I think, maybe you should have guided them more with what you wanted by saying answer yes or no, and then give reasons for why you say yes or no.
Yeah.
Because, with that you can either answer yes or no.
Yes, exactly.
Are you well prepared or are you not?
Exactly.
And then reasons why you say.
Yeah, and that's actually what I'm kind of trying to move towards, is that the way in which you ask your question, and CAPS is at the moment so emotionally laden, that whole concept, that you can expect, if you're going to throw that in there, you can expect a rant about CAPS. Yes. And that's actually, we see quite a lot of that here. So maybe if all the concepts required for extended writing just don't even mention CAPS, you might have or then be specific about the elements that you're referring to or the concepts that you're referring to. So the question might actually stymie you in getting the data that you want, so that they get sidetracked and you're not getting rich enough data. Yes. Yes. Yeah, that's what she also said. That if you do look at the rounds of we didn't have enough training, then obviously they're not feeling well prepared. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
It also appears to me that the question addresses the teacher in a certain way. The teacher is the one who has to implement certain policy, while a lot of the answers that might seem off topic also address themselves as teacher in another way. I'm not just an implementer. I have an opinion about this policy, and I have ownership about it. So it says something about how we see teachers as professionals.
Yes, and how little input they have in the development of a curriculum. The one who says they should use a week for this and a week for that and a week for that, that's criticism on the way in which the curriculum is set out. And you're absolutely right. That says something about, the question says something about, they're basically just the foot soldiers, giving expression to the orders from above. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Right. I wanted to go into ways in which you can present the data, because, as I said, often doing the analysis, and from what I've heard from your side, you don't have a problem analyzing the data. But it's often with how we present the data that we might get into trouble, or that it might be difficult to think of how can I put this down on paper. And I want to show you just a few ideas about how some of the theses that I've read or that I've supervised, how people present their data. So this is one example. This was a student observing a class. And so she wrote down the what she saw in the class, the words. She's obviously recorded the teacher, and so she wrote down what happened in class. And then on the right-hand side, she had a kind of a margin in which she commented on what happened in the class. And so on the right-hand side, you see her comments on what happened in the class. And if we look for some proof in the text of what she said, you can actually see that. She says that the learners don't respond to her questions, and there you see no response from the class. And then the teacher is skeptical about the concepts, she says, and all that stuff. So can you see that she's constantly referring back to this transcript of hers? And the other one, uncertainty and hesitation from the side of the learners. I could have given you a lot more, but that's just one way of presenting it, of giving the words and on the right-hand side interpreting, but always sticking very closely to what's happening in that analysis. This is another way of presenting it. This student found this particular theme, challenges to learning. She interviewed a number of first-year students, quite a big number of first-year students, in fact, over a period of time. And so as they carried on through their first year, she found that they identified a number of challenges. And so she had that as a main theme. And then she had sub-themes or subcategories. I'm not always sure. Some people see categories as the overarching heading and then themes as the lower order headings, or the other way around. It depends entirely on you. So then she identified the other sub-themes and then smaller categories below each sub-theme. So that was the way in which she presented it at the start of her of that specific section on learning challenges, and then she discussed each of them in turn. So that helps you to just keep track and to impose some kind of order and structure on all the data, because it is quite a lot. It usually is quite a lot. Qualitative data is usually, you've got huge data sets. So to impose some kind of order on it so that you can write in a way that your reader can follow with ease, it helps. These kinds of diagrammatic presentations help you. Another way in which you can, that's also a useful authors to look for, Granaheim and Landman. What he did was to start on the left-hand side with an actual quote from the data, which he then reduced to, in this case, it was the academic word list. So the teachers that he interviewed referred to the academic word list. And then he condensed that further, and that became his meaning, what he called his condensed meaning unit. And so from that condensed meaning unit, he found all his sub-themes. So again, a way in which to present the data and a way in which to structure the data so that your reader immediately sees where you're coming from. We normally say that if you present your data, that you need to quote from the data. You need to present quotes from the data. And this is one way of doing it, so that you start with a quote and then you show how you actually provided labels for those specific kinds of utterances. So you've got one example of the focus on academic vocabulary, and then you say, this is how I condensed it, and this is how I then identified my different themes. Yes, you wanted to.
Yeah, just a quick question. Would you wait until you've got all your data in before you start analyzing it? Or do you think if you've got two sets of, if it's questionnaires or interviews, that you start analyzing that and then, because it's quite a long process, to collect your data. So when you start analyzing all of it, I don't know what was easiest. What do you think would work best?
My instinct would be to say wait until you've got everything. But as you say, it is a long process. And from my own experience, I was working with somebody these past few years, and we collected data every year. So now you want to get some sense of what's happening, so you do start analyzing. The danger is if you see specific themes in one year, that it might predispose you to seeing them in the next data sets. But there are ways in which you can counter that. There are ways in which you can try to look at the data afresh. But I'm going to get to that. But it is very much a matter of the design of your study. If you're doing a longitudinal study, you're going to have to start, in the beginning. You can't really wait until the very end, especially if you're doing your PhD. You might then carry on for 10 years, which you seriously don't want to do. Okay, so just the main point is that it is an iterative process. So you have to go through it again and again and again and refine the analysis. Just some tips about these analyses, discourse or thematic or conceptual. The categories do change and they merge. So that's if you look at your data sets over time, you might find that because of what you see later, that might change what you initially had. So you might go back and either refine or revise or change your initial categories. And of course, they aren't watertight. They are going to a specific concept, and the specific way in which it is determined by the code text might actually link up with other concepts. If you think of the data that you've looked at just now, the whole thing of teacher experience can be linked to the concept of time, but it can also be linked to the things that the teachers identify in their data as to what are the things that help them. So some of them mention experience, some of them mention their HOD, some of them mention their super CAPS presenter. So those are resources that they mention. That's another category. But you're going to mention some of the things around the category of time will also be mentioned in that category. So remember that they aren't watertight, and you need to say that when you write. You need to say that this specific example can also be linked to that category. We all accept that these categories are not watertight. So don't try to make them watertight. Okay, I want to talk about huge volumes of data. If you've got a lot of information, how you can get an entry point. Because it is one thing to sit with something like this, and in the end, I think he had 5 pages of data like this. So that's not necessarily a big, that's not a particularly big data set, because not all the teachers chose to say something in that final question. But if you've got data sets over time, then it does become intimidating. If you've got, the one example I'm thinking of is we asked students to respond to a few questions, and just on question 1, we had 64 typed pages of responses. So that's quite intimidating to get into. So it helps to sit and just read through it, put the pens away, just read through it, and try and see if you can find recurring words. Because you don't want, it's not possible to do an immediate full analysis. So you want a few words just to get an entry point. And what I want to suggest is the one technique that you can use is word counts. I want to show you an example of a word count that we did on the data that I've just told you about. So you can see here are some of the words that we found in the text, and then simply with word you can search for that specific term. And of course with clear you're going to get clearly, but you're not going to get clarity. So you've got to search separately for those two, but they all belong to the same concept or the same idea, the same theme. The same with easily, easy, ease, easier. And there you can see the other words. That's just some of the examples of the words that we used. We tried to link the specific concepts that we identified to specific words. And that for me is part of the rigor of the process, that it's not just simply such a vague theme that you really can't link it to specific words in your data set. But what's interesting here is if you look at something like that, the data that we had in 2018 was almost 3 times what we had in the previous years. But if you look at the whole idea of sentences that flow, they were asked what is good writing. If you look at the whole point about sentences flowing, then in year 1 there were 35, and in 2018, where we had the most students, only 17 used the word and expressed that kind of idea. So over time you can see that that idea is not evenly spread throughout the data, and it's possible that the students were in another class and the lecturer said, your ideas have to flow. And they come in your group and you ask a question and that's in their minds and they write it down. So there are so many, circumstances that might determine why they would use a specific phrase or words more in one year than in the other. But that's what this more quantitative take on the data might give you, a more nuanced view of what's happening in your data. So a word count can be particularly useful. With that concept, kind of remained the same over years 1 and 2, and again, in 2018, only 16 occurrences of that idea. So I like the idea of word counts. But to get back to your question about if you start with a set of data and then and you're still collecting data, your ideas might become fixed about what the data should be giving you because you have started analyzing already. And that's exactly what happened to us. We saw these ideas in the first 2 years and then we thought, well, they must be in the third year as well. I mean, why not? And they weren't. And the thing that made us look differently, please don't laugh out loud, but this is actually quite an interesting technique, and that is using word clouds. You have to, I don't know if you've ever seen these. It's a free tool on the internet. You can, you use it. The important thing is to take out the words that are going to that might not be that interesting for your question. I'm talking about words like English and Afrikaans. That wasn't, that was part of the question was, do you use other languages when you write? Do you think in other languages when you write? And so they would say yes, which was important for us, but that they were thinking in Afrikaans and English wasn't as important. So maybe we should have taken those out. But what was interesting was that other words came up as words that repeated in the data. And that kind of gave us a fresh look at the data. So just using another technique suddenly made us look for other things in the data as well. You can see there are a few concepts like difficult, struggle, challenging, which we actually didn't really focus on that much. So that made us look at the data differently. And that means that you go back to the data of 2016 and you look at that data again. And that's the whole idea of this iterative process. The same with translate, etc. So it's just a technique that you can use to maybe get another perspective on your data or to get an entry point into your data. Yes, you wanted?
I have an idea what word cloud is. Can you explain that?
It's a computer program which you copy and paste text from your data into this. It's very simple. The one that there's one called Wordle, and there's another one called Word It Out. But if you Google word clouds, you're going to get any one of these, and you copy and paste it into an area. And the program itself, if you use English, of course, the program itself will eliminate words like and, but, the, in, on, the function words. So if you put in your text, then it's going to throw out something like this. And the more words you exclude, words that might not necessarily be that important, because when people respond to a question, they often repeat the words of the question. And that might not be, so that's going to be your most frequent words, and that's not interesting. You want the answer. So it could be that you tell the program to eliminate the words from the question. And in that way, you then get the responses from the from the students or the learners or the teachers. And the words that are used most frequently are the biggest. And then the smaller words are, the smaller the words become, the less often they're used. You can also use what are called concordances, but those are more sophisticated tools that you probably have to pay for. So I think that might not be such a great idea. Yes?
I mean, I didn't use word cloud, I just did the manual counting the words under, because my first question in my interview was their understanding of a particular concept which is core to the research.
Mm.
And I needed to get an understanding of the words they were using against what the policymakers and, well, I'm not going to go into what the answers were, but
Yeah.
I just manually counted. So many of them actually used the same word, whereas the teachers and then talking to the people in the head office,
Yeah.
policymakers, how their understanding of it, and they use completely different
Okay.
words.
But if you've got it electronically, you can use Word.
Yeah,
I mean,
from
you
the
can just
interview,
simply, ask it to, Okay. Yeah, I think these electronic ways of doing it might seem contrary to qualitative data analysis, but it is an entry point into the data. And word frequency counts really give you some idea of actually, how in your case, what words the teachers used and what words the curriculum developers probably
But
used.
also in Atlas TI, if you, as you highlight, you can see the concept and then it just
Yes,
tabulates.
exactly,
It's the
yeah.
7th time, it's the 8th time that same word is used across the interviews.
Yeah.
People are using Atlas TI.
Yeah. Yeah, of course there are workshops on Atlas TI at the beginning of next year if you are interested, which is also qualitative data analysis tool. But you do need somebody to show you how to do that. That's more complicated. Right, so I think my time is up. Just in conclusion, my time is way up. I'm sorry. I think the most important point is to not just describe that you need to interpret, and you need to ground your interpretation in the words and the ideas expressed in the data itself. Thank you very much. Sorry, Pete.
Just in this last section, I'm just forgetting about the microphone. We're going to have a look at narrative analysis, and then we'll have a short conclusion about how do you choose your method of data analysis. We'll just revisit that question, or your methods of data analysis. Okay. So far today, what we've concentrated on thematic content analysis and discourse analysis. So we've got those two approaches to analysis. So we're going to shift to looking at narratives and then talking about how can you analyze narratives. And you can analyze them using thematic content analysis. Okay, so and as well as discourse analysis. So we won't revisit those. I want to look at a couple of other ways of analyzing narratives, and that includes literary analysis and figurative analysis. Thanks very much. Okay. So just to briefly revisit the idea of narrative. So what is narrative? The idea of a narrative text is a text in which a subject conveys to an addressee a story. So narratives are about stories, and we often we collect narratives in educational research as one method of data collection. Okay, so that you could do that through interviews, or you could ask people to write their stories, and often stories give us insight into educational problems and questions. Right? Are any of you using narrative as part of your methods? Okay, right. So we've got a couple of people, and right. So there's different kinds of narratives. For example, a biography is one kind of narrative. An autobiography, a life history, a novel. All of these are different ways of telling stories. And narratives are not necessarily only written. You could have a documentary, or someone could tell a story using photos and so on. So there's many different types of narratives. It can take many different forms, as I've mentioned. I think this is quite important just to recognize the difference between first-order narratives and second-order narratives. It's something we mentioned, I think, in our last session, that the first-order narrative would be the narrator telling the story. Right. So if you go and interview someone and they tell you the story of them becoming a teacher, that would be the first-order narrative. But then when you report the story, then you're changing that into, say, a written text, and then you're deciding how to organize it and whether to present it in the first person, like I did this or that, or the third person, she or he did this or that. You see what I mean? So that you call that a second-order narrative, right? So it's important to recognize that difference. Is everyone clear about that? First and second. So you can't just say you're taking the narrative and presenting it directly, because you're always mediating it. Okay, you're always reconstructing it in some way. And it's important to think about how you do that and why you do that. Okay, so anyway, those are just some things about narrative. I just want to move on to looking at analyzing narratives. Okay. And I'm going to show you a part of a life history narrative. So life history is a certain kind of narrative where you ask a person to tell you about their lives, but one particular aspect of their lives. Okay? So you might say you're investigating people's experience of education, and you're going to ask them to tell you about their lives around this aspect of education. Okay, so that would be a life history narrative. So we use some of these life histories when I was teaching on a certificate for education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And the students were community workers, people working in communities, often of a whole range of ages and with sort of a basic level of education. But they had a lot of life experience. So we asked them to write a narrative about their learning, about their learning through their lives, their lifelong learning. This was part of the idea of learning about their own learning and reflecting on their journeys as learners. So I'm just going to show you an extract from one of those narratives. It was from someone, her name was Busi Siwe, and she was very pleased to share her narrative. Okay, so I got permission to use the narrative, and she didn't want to have her name changed. She was pleased with her, to share her story. So I'm just going to hand you out this narrative, and then we'll have a look at some different ways of analyzing the narrative. Okay. Right, so it's just called Busi Siwe's story. It's not the whole story, because we haven't really got time to show the whole thing. I'd like you to have a look at it. As I said, we're not going to do a content analysis, so we won't look at the themes, but we'll have a look at, we're going to do a literary analysis. So we're going to look at, first of all, the point of view. In other words, how is she telling the story? Is it the first person or the third person? And then we'll look at the characters, right? And then we'll also look at issues around the setting. Right, so if we just have a look at the first paragraph there. Busi Siwe says, "I'm very honored to get this opportunity to write about my personal history. I think it will help me to reflect on my life experiences, good or bad, and learn from them." Right. So if we're just looking at that paragraph, and we look at it, we use the category of point of view. What could we say about the point of view there? I don't know, are some of you language teachers or literature teachers? If we're talking about point of view, we're talking about the perspective from which it's written. Okay. Yes. Yes, so she's using I. Eh? So we'd call that first person point of view. She's not saying she. She doesn't say she was very honored to get, so she's writing from her own point of view. Does that make sense? So you'd call it a first person point of view. Right. And that's represented by the word I. But if you look carefully at that word I, it's quite a complicated word because it doesn't refer to only one position. So just have a look at it again. She says, I am very honored to get this opportunity to write about my personal history. I think it will help me to reflect on my life experiences, good and bad, and learn more from them. So if I say the I is complicated, can you see that it represents more than one position and more than one time? Right. So we have, I'm writing, I'm the writer, eh? But I'm also the character. I'm writing about myself. So you have those two positions, the writer and the character. And that's one of the complexities of first-person narratives, because you're writing about yourself as the character, the main character. And so there's that dual relation. You're writing about this person who's also yourself, and you're reflecting on what happened to that person who is you. So there's a kind of dialogue going between your past and present selves. Right. So that's interesting from a perspective of point of view. And you'll see that as it goes through. So if we have a look at the second paragraph, my parents originated from Mpendle, a rural area of northern KwaZulu-Natal. They had a very low standard of education. Father had to leave school early due to the loss of his father. He had to go and work in the fields to support his family. In my mother's custom, there was no need to educate a girl, since she was to get married and go to another family, and they believed that an educated girl misbehaves. Right. So if you look there, the I is now kind of gone below the surface. You see there's some other characters coming in. Eh? So who are the other characters now? Right, so the mother and the father. So we've got the writer, Busisiwe, and then the mother and the father are other important characters. And it's interesting to think about the characteristics of these characters, what she's presenting about them, what she chooses to highlight. Okay? Because remember, when you're telling a story, you're always choosing to say this and not that. Eh? It's always about choices. You're constructing it in a particular way. Eh? So if you look at the way she constructs her mother and her father as characters, what is she kind of emphasizing about them? Okay, education, right, and culture in a way. So she's telling us a little bit about the way the parents were situated within their cultures, right? So the man, if we look at the father, work is associated with work in the fields, support his family, right? So quite conventional male roles. And then he leaves school early. My mother's custom, no need to educate the girl. She's associated with getting married and going to another family. So do you see how we've got quite strong gender type of roles associated with the mother and the father? Eh? And it's interesting that Busisiwe highlights those rather than other things like maybe temperament or whatever. Yes. Yes?
Did you also here bring in a bit of discourse analysis?
Yes.
Father versus my mother.
Yes.
It's quite stark
Yeah.
in this paragraph.
Absolutely. You could do a really interesting discourse analysis, and that would be another, and it would reveal other things, I think.
And so my question really is, would you bring it into your narrative?
You could, you could. You could point that out when you're talking about the characters, for example. Yeah, so you can combine different forms of analysis depending on your purpose. All right. And then if you have a look at the next paragraph, due to lack of paying jobs, my father came to Pietermaritzburg city to seek green pastures. My mother often came to visit him at Edendale, where he rented a room till they decided that she must come and stay permanently. After a while, they decided to seek a plot to build their own home. At that time, they only had one child, my eldest brother. Okay, so you see the point of view, the I has become my. You see that transition. So there's still an I telling a story, but she's telling the story about other characters, and that's interesting because it kind of tells you that when a person's telling their life history or their personal history, it's never just their story. It's always a story about other people, and it's often a story about other stories, bigger stories. So here Busisiwe is telling a story about herself, about her parents and her family, but also it's telling a bigger story about communities. Right? So do you notice any bigger social patterns in the story she's telling? Migration, eh? So we've got this movement from the countryside to the city. Eh? So urbanization, big story. And we can see a story that's continuing to happen in our cities. Even in the Western Cape, we see how rapidly the urban areas are expanding. So we have this common story of people coming to the cities. And often it's linked to, why? Why in this particular story, why do we have this movement from the rural to the urban? Work, yes. To survival, eh? Right, so what does she say? She says, to seek green pastures, eh?
And also in terms of her education, what that is.
Her education, that's right.
Because that's what she's talking about.
Yeah, that's right. So that's a kind of underlying theme that's running through the whole story, eh? My learning and education. And this is linked to that. Due to lack of paying jobs, my father came to Pietermaritzburg. Okay, so it's very explicit. And then she talks about her family, the boys and girls, and the process of naming. I was given the name Busisiwe, which means blessed. They said they were blessed to have another girl in a majority of boys. Okay, and then she goes into her schooling and talks about her experiences of schooling. Right. So when we're analyzing narrative, we can use literary characters, literary categories that we'd use to analyze novels and short stories. Eh? So things like point of view, character, plot. Plot would be another thing. So plot would be the main events that are set out and how those events are arranged. So here she's plotting it in a certain way. So she talks about, she starts with her parents, her parents' history, and then the parents' movement to the city, then your own particular educational history. But you can plot it in many different ways. She could have started with her own history and then gone back to her parents, or left out her parents' history. You see what I mean? So the way you plot involves choices as well. And that shows you what's important for the person and how they arrange them and link them. So clearly for Busisiwe, her family is really important. Her story is the story of the family and the bigger community as well.
But that also depends on the question that was asked.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Steer them and where to start.
Yes, that's right. And I think that the handout that Professor van der Walt gave you is really useful because it says, when you're looking at a document, you need to explain, where it comes from, what the context is. And so part of the context would be what was the exercise they were doing here and what were the instructions and so on, because that frames the task. Okay. So here the task was write about your learning history, and this is the way she interpreted it. Okay. So I think another aspect of narrative analysis would be to look at the kinds of figurative language that is used. Okay, so the kinds of images, and we touched on that with the discourse analysis, but often that gives you insight into the way people understand their worlds. okay, because they're using particular pictures or vivid language to describe that world. So if you have a look at this narrative, do you notice any figurative language that she's using?
Seek green pasture.
Okay, right. Okay, so in that third paragraph, is it right? Due to lack of paying jobs, my father came to Pietermaritzburg city to seek green pastures. Okay, so that idea of green pastures, or the grass is green, always greener on the other side, you know, that's a powerful sort of image within the English language. But if you probe it a little bit, it's interesting in the way that it's used, because she's talking about moving from the rural area to the city to seek green pastures. You see that?
Yeah.
What's interesting about it? Any thoughts on that? Yeah.
The rural area is normally where it's green and
Yes, that's right.
and we've got it all, lots of space. And
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's sort of ironic in a way, because the pastures, the idea of a rich farming area, is now associated with the city, which is not a pasture. So you have that gets you to start to thinking about what's going on with the rural pastures. Okay, why are they no longer green? And why is that now transferred to an urban situation, which takes you into South African history, okay, and issues around dispossession, the Land Act, and all of those issues. So do you see how, again, just one little phrase, to seek green pastures, suddenly resonates across a whole personal and national history. So that's why it's useful to look at these figurative language, because it often evokes something that's bigger than that particular context. Okay. Just have a look at the last paragraph there. I started school in 1964 in Henryville Primary School, the then Catholic school, since we are Catholics in my family. I proved to be a very clever pupil. I got distinctions in all my subjects. At the age of 11, whilst doing Standard 4, I lost my father through lung cancer, which was a setback to me because I was his favorite child and he spoilt me a little. My mother was devastated. That left us very poor since my father was the breadwinner. My mother then started to do odd jobs for neighbors, like washing, ironing, gardening, and collecting wood to put food on the table. From the little she got from her jobs, she managed to save and bought second-hand clothes to sell. She also used to knit and crochet baby shawls, jerseys, and hats. She taught us, too, that we would help her if she had many orders. We used to knit in the evenings when we had finished our chores and our schoolwork. That was the time when our grandmother, from my father's side, who was living with us, would tell us stories of our forebears and fairy tales. We enjoyed it a lot. Okay. So again, remember, she's writing about her school, her learning. So that's an important type of theme that's running through. But you notice how there's a lot of different kinds of learning going on. What could we say about learning? The theme of learning that's emerging here. Anything that struck you about that? Okay. Yes. So it's learning is here. It's very situated or situational. All right. So I think that's an important point. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yes. Okay, right. So we've got different kinds of skill and knowledge that are coming through. The schooling side of it, okay, later in the story she talks more about her schooling. So I didn't include it here. But what's interesting in it is how she's emphasizing informal learning. Right. So learning from her mother, learning all of these skills, quite detailed skills. If you look at them, there's a lot around knitting, crocheting, washing, ironing, gardening, collecting wood, and then learning from her grandmother as well. Do you notice that? The stories from her grandmother, which is about cultural learning. So there's a kind of counterpoint between formal school learning and informal community, family type of learning, which is very rich. And then we also have the thread of learning around religion, the Catholic side of it. Okay.
And you can also tie, like, my mother now has to be the breadwinner and put food on the table.
Okay.
That sort of figurative language you can tie back to the previous paragraph, the second paragraph, where she talks about her father being the support of the family.
Yes.
So sort of linking that back.
Okay, good, yeah. So that we see that image of the breadwinner, the idea of bread and the food on the table. So that also points to the importance of that basic survival. And in a way, it links to the idea of green pastures, because the pastures is what nourishes you, right? And we see here that that movement from the father doing that, or primarily doing that, to the mother, and that links to all kinds of issues around gender and work and survival. Okay, so yeah, yes.
It's also interesting in the language says that was a time when our grandmother, she doesn't say my grandmother. So
Yes.
there's between the communal learning thing, do you know what I mean? And then also, for me, in that last sentence, it almost links to the very first one where she's telling us, but she's also reflecting, where she's saying, we enjoyed that a lot. There
Yes.
seems to be a narrative within the narrative. I don't know.
Yes. Yeah. That's nice. So you see, she's moving between those positions of here, the writer in the present, and the young girl at that time, and linking the two all the time, and in the process reflecting on how she has developed from being that child, girl, young woman, to the woman she is today. So that's links to the idea of the complexity within the point of view of someone who's telling a story, being both the narrator and the character. Okay. Right, so does that give you a feeling of how you can use a literary analysis, looking at things like point of view, characters, plot, as well as themes, and that might give you a different perspective from only doing a content analysis. Right? And your literary analysis could include an analysis of things like metaphors, figures of speech, okay, those kinds of things, because they often give you a slightly different insight into the meaning of the story. Okay. So what I've tried to, we haven't got that much time now, but what I've tried to touch on is that when you're looking at narratives, you can analyze them in multiple ways, right? You can do just a straight content analysis, and I'll just show you what that might look like. Let me just find it. Yeah, this one here. Yeah. So there, you see, I've taken the first paragraph there, and just did a content analysis. So we see there. She's talking about things like writing, reflecting, learning. It was similar to what we did earlier. Eh? So there we've highlighted some of the themes, and then you could code those themes and link them, and then analyze the whole story using those kinds of themes. Right. But if you do a literary analysis, then you're looking at things like point of view, characters, plot, which gives you a different insight into the story. And then we could do a figurative analysis, which looks at things like metaphors, figures of speech, images, and then again that gives you another kind of insight, which we might not have got from those things. So looking at the idea of green pastures, breadwinner, food on the table, those images, they kind of pull out the whole issue of survival, sustenance, in a way that might not come out in the same way, thematic content analysis.
And they can even point to sort of gender roles, because the dad was the support, but the mom putting food on the table.
Yes,
Even though she
absolutely.
was supporting it.
Yes. Yeah, so you could use those concepts which would fit in nicely with the discourse analysis, right? Because there is a kind of discourse around gender in this story. And in fact, it continues because some of the patterns are repeated. You know, when she goes to school, she has to drop out because she's pregnant, right? Which causes conflict in the family and so on and so on. So we see patterns of gender and relations between the genders that recur through the generations, actually. So a discourse analysis which focuses on gender and how gender is constructed would also be really fruitful, I think, in this narrative. Yeah. So the more you look at a text, the more generative it can become. And then you have to decide what is going to be the most useful way of analyzing it. And you can do it in more than one way. And then you need to just work out how does that link with your research questions and your purpose, and how can you justify the method that you use. Okay. Okay, you're doing well. 12:30. Okay. Right. So I'm just going to move on now and to this question, which is a question we started to look at earlier on today, and that is how do you choose your data analysis strategies. So what I'm saying is the fitness for purpose is the key thing. Your strategy must help you to achieve the purpose of your research and to answer your research questions. Right? So if, say for example, your purpose is to test something, right? Then you might use a deductive form of data analysis, and it might be more quantitative, right? Whereas if your purpose is to explore, that's typically associated with a more inductive, qualitative process of data analysis, right? So there needs to be an alignment between your purpose, your questions, and your methods of data collection and analysis. They need to all be coherently aligned. So that'll guide you in choosing methods of data analysis. Okay. Right. I think this tries to capture that idea in a diagrammatic form. So you start with some sort of research purpose, right? My purpose is to investigate the perceptions of teachers regarding CAPS in grade 7 maths or something, right? Then from your purpose you develop research questions, okay? How do the teachers perceive CAPS? Why do they perceive it in this way, etc.? And then from there you develop your methods of data collection. I'm going to interview the teachers, okay? I'm going to ask them to, and then I'll have a focus group or something like that. Then you collect the data, then you do the data analysis. So you've got your data from the interviews and from the focus groups. Then you might decide, right, in order to help me answer my questions, I'm going to do a thematic content analysis of this data to see what comes out regarding their perceptions of CAPS and the reasons for their perception, something like that. Right? And then you'll be able to interpret that, which feeds into the findings, and your findings should then answer your questions, right? And achieve your purpose. So do you see how it's all tied up? So that would mean you've got a coherent research design, because the different parts of your research design fit with each other. And that's really important when you're planning, when you're writing up your proposal, which some of you are busy with, to make sure your design is coherent, but also with those who are doing data analysis, to make sure that your methods of analysis are going to help you actually answer those research questions and achieve your purpose. Okay. And you see I've got at the center this idea of recursive, meaning you go backwards and forwards. That is not just a linear journey with one stop at each place, but you go back and then and we were talking about this earlier, how you might be doing your data collection, you see that certain themes are emerging from your data collection, and you realize you haven't read enough about that. So you go back to your literature and read more on that issue, and then go and collect a bit more data and analyze it and so on. So you see how it's all linked. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Right, now what I want to do is just give you a little bit of time to talk about your data analysis ideas. Right. So what methods of data analysis will you use, and why will you use those methods? Okay. I'm just going to give you about 10 minutes to talk about that. Can we do that in groups of 3? So if you can just join and make groups of 3, and then so the 2 questions: what methods of data analysis will you use, and why will you use those methods? Or what have you used if you're further along, and why did you choose them? Okay. Okay, right. So if you can just perhaps will one of you join this group? One. Tracy, will you join? Oh, you join. Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Or maybe I'll just let you carry on. I'll go home and you can carry on the rest of the afternoon. Okay, but I think you're having really good discussions, and I think probably this is part of the most useful learning for you when you have a chance to share and your ideas and your experiences. So I'm sorry to stop you, but I'm sure you can also continue these conversations by setting up links with each other. So I think that quite often postgrad students learn as much from each other as from any lecturer and whatever. So I think that's a good strategy. Right. So you've had a chance to just think about your methods of data analysis. And now we've just got, just to conclude, let's just think about, data analysis within your broader research project. Okay, so each of you engaged at some stage with a research project. Either you working on a proposal or thinking about a proposal, or you've got your proposal accepted and you're thinking about doing the research, or some of you've collected data and you're busy thinking about or doing data analysis. Okay, so you're at different sorts of stages with the process of data analysis, and maybe we can just I can just ask you after this particular workshop, what are your thoughts about data analysis now? How do you feel about doing the data analysis, or is it Shadrach?
I think I wasn't very clear. But now I'm confident. I think I've known what I will do.
Okay.
I think so that it's the proper study is connecting with itself.
Yes.
Like I came up with a theory, which I from literature.
Yes.
So now I know that I'll go deductive way and test it.
Yes.
And the methods I'm going to use. So it's very clear. It's very helpful.
Okay, good. So you feel clearer about your strategy. So you feel that you're going to adopt a deductive strategy, and that'll help you to analyze your data, and that you're able to link it to the literature as well. I think that's a really important point. It's good to look at other studies and how other people have done it. Right. So if you're thinking of using a content analysis, go and have a look at other theses or other articles and see how they do it, because that'll also help you a lot, especially if you can find studies that are sort of on your topic or on a similar topic, because that just gives you a different insight to simply hearing how to do it from in this kind of workshop. So go and read, that's really important. And then when you're writing your methodology section of your proposal or your chapter, you can use that literature to justify your methodology and explain why you're doing it the same or how you're adapting it. Okay. Any other thoughts on what are you thinking now about data analysis in relation to your project? Yes?
I like that entry point idea, because it just gives me some insight into how to actually structure it and how to process the data that I've collected.
Okay.
Which has been great.
So when you say the entry point, what do you mean
It's
by
when the discourse, what is that, discourse analysis.
Yes.
How to just get in there and use that as an entry point and
Okay.
look at the entire picture.
Okay, great. Oh yes, that diagram with the lines. Yeah, that's good. Okay. So that spoke to you. Yeah, thank you. Right, yes?
For me, it was quite good to see. I always knew I was going to do content analysis, but there were issues around discourse analysis that was kind of niggling me, because I
Yes.
was picking it up, and I didn't really know how could I do this, how far could I do, because it almost seemed like a different analysis,
Yes.
which it is.
Yes.
But it's the idea that I could mix a little bit of that into the content and the thematic analysis.
Yes.
Has been good.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's
and
great.
then also just confirming what I'm doing is sort of on the right path in terms of content analysis,
Yes.
in terms of creating sort of units of analysis
Yes.
and fitting that into the bigger themes and
Yes.
research questions.
Okay, great. Yeah. So you're starting to think about how you can use more than one method of data analysis, and how they might relate to each other and to the bigger project that you're
Yes,
doing.
and also how I can keep perspective of the discourse analysis, because that can, I know myself, I can run away with that because I
Yes.
love words and language, and so I
Yes.
can sit there with that forever.
Yeah.
But really, that's not my primary focus, because discourse analysis is a whole different
Yes.
thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's about also situating it within the project, and how it's going, how will it link to your questions and your purpose and your findings and so on. Great, thank you. Any other thoughts? Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, sorry. I think it was really useful for me because I felt like I was going over the same things over again. I realized actually you're supposed to.
Yes.
Not finding new things. So, obviously not going to go on and on, but I kept looking at the interviews. I've got all my data now.
Yeah.
So I'm pleased to hear that actually that is what we're supposed to be doing.
Yes.
And now then continue trying to make sense of it.
Yeah.
Putting it into categories and then taking a step back and then going into it.
Yes.
Because then I thought I was actually going back to literature, but then, as you said, it's a recursive process.
Yeah. Yes, so this thing about iteration, you look at the data again and again, and it's eventually you start dreaming about the data, and talking to your children and your husband about the data and whatever. So, but that's how it should be, because then that helps to deepen your understanding of the data. Okay, and then sometimes you get insights far down the road that you wouldn't have expected. And it's just because you've been thinking about it for so long that your mind is receptive to new understandings. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else would like to say anything? Okay. Yeah, okay. Right. So good luck with your data analysis, whatever stage you are in thinking about it. And we'll see you next month. Okay. So towards the end of September, I can't remember that, yeah? Okay,